What an exciting topic we have tonight, and we appreciate this being a build on some already great material that has been shared, and I have no doubt you're going to find this equally exciting, what we're talking about tonight. This is really an area, if we look at some of the exciting new things that are happening in technology, this is one of the areas that is really on the precipice of doing some incredible things. Now, you also cannot have a talk without having AI in it. So, that was, again, AI in Bloom has gone over really well because we continue to build on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight some of what we're doing to augment our clinical care, but I'm going to let the experts do that because you don't want a lay administrator up here sharing about how do you get good health care. So as you know very well, that's a bad strategy, but we've got a lot of great expertise internally. Our speakers will specifically deal in and dive into some of the things that we're working on. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the technologies that are actually in place. I will tell you, you can't go through your inbox nowadays without a new application or new support tool or something that's being identified. And so assessing and getting through those, making sure that we're using the right tools and models are an important aspect of that. But before I do that, let me talk just for a minute about some of the things that we're working on and some of the things that we're looking at specifically. Now, as you might know, we have about 30 applications that are actually live in our clinical environment now. There's a host of different products that we're looking at in different areas, not only to help really augment what the physician is doing, but also to help a little bit in their work-life balance. We're actually piloting a couple tools that are actually looking at not only how do you diagnose in a quicker form pathology slides. We're one of the few hospitals that are actually in the country that has all of our pathology actually digitized. And so everything, and I didn't even know what a petabyte was until I learned that terabytes were so small, and it keeps growing. But you look at the amount of imaging data that's coming out of this. Actually, one of our scientists internally has developed something called Nuclei.io that has the ability to diagnose faster within what we're doing with our pathology slides. We have a tool that's actually in a research form that actually is looking at the preliminary results when you come into the emergency department of whether you should get an EKG ahead of when you see the physician to diagnose faster a potential heart attack. Even down to what is called DAX, which is actually a ambient voice technology that's in the clinics that it can actually listen to what not only you're saying, but what the doctor's saying, and actually transcribe, but also draft a note from the visit and a summary that goes into the medical record, both saving time for the physician, but also making it easier. So there's a lot of things that are coming out, and I think really, I would say the possibilities are truly endless if you look at the different perspectives that we're using on that. So as we think about what we're looking at tonight, I hope what you'll see from the technologies that we have and some of the things that we're doing, I would also say from the things that actually, there's probably some folks in the room that are working with these technologies now, just having talked to a few of you. I hope that you see that that innovation that gets spurred by things that are happening in the community and are happening here will continue the great work that we're doing. And in fact, even some of the things that you may already be supporting from that perspective. Now, you did not come here tonight to hear me, so I wanted to truly say welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We hope that the time that you have is exciting. We're going to share a few things, but there's also going to be an opportunity to engage. So think about some of those questions that you have and perspectives that you may want to work on and look at, because we'll have the time to do that as well. Without further ado, let me actually turn our time over to Dr. Nigam Shah. Nigam is our chief data scientist. He's also the head of one of the research areas in the School of Medicine, and quite frankly helps drive a lot of this discussion internally. And I know the presentation that he will share will really bring a lot of insight. So Dr. Shah, let me turn the time over to you.
Thank you. Okay. I like walk around. I might fall off the stage. So I'll take about 20 minutes. I have a few slides, about 12 or 13 slides. And what I'll try to do is give you a flavor for how do we shape the responsible adoption, focusing both on the challenges and opportunities. And I'll close with the opportunities, obviously, because that's the more fun conversation. So So as David was mentioning, we have about 30 things running. Some of the administrative stuff, some for patient engagement, driving quality clinical decision support, clinician efficiency, helping in basket responses, automated transcription. If you happen to be in our primary care clinics, you might actually get to see it, where a physician, when you show up, will record the whole encounter on the phone, and before you're done, they'll turn the screen around and show you what the computer produced as a written document. So all of these things are in play right now. But what we'll talk about today is a little bit about where we're headed. And so to begin with that, one of the most important things that's worth keeping in mind is good AI comes from good data. And when we talk of data, I find it very useful to think of a patient timeline. Because real things happen over time. So here it's a fictional record of an individual going left to right over time. And then you might have a hospital admission, you might go to the ICU for a bit. And then depending on what happened, we collect some information. In this case, there's ECG, there's cardiac output being measured, fluid balance, medication orders, things like that. Now, we never have this thing, give it a name, let's call it the patient timeline object. Now, people get care at different places, so we never have it complete. Like any modality, let's just say ECG. No one has a 5-year longitudinal record of their ECG. And at a given encounter, we don't measure everything. There's probably 500 modalities, maybe 1,000 modalities we can measure. MRIs, EEGs, EKGs, every hole in the body, put a camera up and take a video. I just turned of that age when a certain video was taken. Exactly. People over 45 all know that stuff. There's genome information, variables, but we never get everything at the same time. But as we think holistically about where these technologies are headed, we have to think about this entire patient timeline object. Right now, the innovations we see are, let's analyze this EKG and figure out if you're having a heart attack, or let's analyze this image and figure out if you have coronary artery calcium in your heart arteries. But increasingly, we're going to see the use of the entire record. Okay, but what will we do with this? Well, we build models. So here's a little model. I'm not going to show you equations at this late in the day. And these models could be things like logistic regressions and deep neural nets and whatever. For the purpose of today's conversation, we're feeding it some data, and it's going to produce a number at the other end. Let's just call that box a model. But what I want to focus on is, what do we do with that? And I would argue that in medicine, models help us do two things, which is make a decision of whether we need to do something and what we need to do. Now, at any given point, there's multiple such decisions to be made, so therefore it's complex. Some of the times the risks intersect, and the thing that needs to be done conflicts with the other thing that needs to be done, like I'm trying to reduce blood pressure, but at the same time, the person is having a high heart rate or having low fluid balance. So that's why it's hard. But at the essence of it, it's two decisions. So from a computer standpoint, the decision of whether to treat is either a classification or a true prediction. And this is also one worth spending a minute on. In general speaking, we may say things like, I look at this picture and I predict there's a dog in there. But that's classification. The thing was a dog before we took the picture. Same thing for medical things. There are people who would say, oh, we have AI that can look at an X-ray and predict if there's pneumonia in there. It's not really a prediction. The pneumonia was already there. You just figured it out. Diagnosis is what is being done. Same thing for sepsis. You might hear about sepsis predictors. There's no such thing as a sepsis predictor. It's the patient has sepsis and we don't yet know. It's a classifier. There are a few things we can predict. 10-year risk of a heart attack, risk of dying in a year, risk of needing some procedure, risk of recurrence of a cancer. There are things we can predict. And of course, the hardest is, based on what happened to other patients in similar situations, what should we do for you? like true personalization of care. Now we can do these activities, these diagnose, prognose, or recommend, and we're an academic medical center, so a lot of it is for advancing the scientific understanding of disease, true discovery. Heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, now we know has 3 subtypes. We thought it was one disease, it's 3. We also do a lot of things to drive the practice, as in, given all these timelines of 4 million patients or other data sets that we can purchase in an anonymized form, how do I decide the right course of action for the next patient? And of course, a lot of things in the delivery. Can we help with staffing decisions? Can we help with this automated transcription? Can we help with cost predictions and things like that? So I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is a project that would be in this square. It was called the Green Button Project. And the idea there is at the bedside, let's say we have a child with mononeuritis multiplex. I'm not sure what to do. But what was done in the 158 other cases that were done? Turns out that you treat with the challenge of steroids, kids are fine. No need to do invasive procedures. So we did about 100 of these, wrote a paper, and then David and Dean Miner asked me, so like, Neil, how are we going to scale this? I was like, well, you can fund me and my 3 students forever and we'll do it. I was like, no, we're talking about scaling to everywhere. I was like, oh. So we went down Sand Hill Road, raised some money, spun out a company. I'll talk about that in just a second. Here's another example, making true predictions. In this case, we can predict who's going to have a massive increase in cost, called a cost bloom. And this study was done with data from Denmark, and an audience member here who I won't name asked me, well, will this work in US data? I said, get me US data and we'll test it. And we did. And this actually is also a freestanding company where we can anticipate about a year ahead who's going to become medically expensive, why will they become expensive, and what can you do about it? So that entity is called Prealize Health. One of the board members is here. I'm not going to call him out, but I'm happy to chat about it. So why does all of this matter? So let's dive into this particular one. So here's a study on the left that a few clinicians did. I was not involved with that. And over about a little over a week, they tracked about 1,200 decisions. And then they went back and said, of the decisions we made, how many had any evidence? 80% had no evidence in any prior published data. And less than 3% had a study specific to the situation at hand. But we have data on millions of patients. So why can we not aggregate all of that and do a study on demand? So in this project, in this Green Button project, we were able to do it with 2 days turnaround. You ask me a question, within 48 hours, we get a report. Spun out a company, they do it in 2 hours. Then LLMs came along. So now they have this chat thingy, which talks to you 24/7 and will design a study which then runs with standard statistics within a few minutes. And you can get evidence that is personalized to your situation. So it puts a whole new take on the meaning of the word precision medicine. All right, so back here, making these predictions. Well, it turns out predictions is the easy part. We can predict who's going to have a cost bloom, no problem. The things we built over 10 years have withstood every horse race they've been in. But after we predict, what can we do? It's the action that we need to focus on. And then whatever the action is, healthcare is always a capacity constrained situation, so we need some policy to allocate our limited capacity. For example, some of you know about this company called Viz.ai, which can analyze an image and figure out if it's a hemorrhagic stroke or an ischemic stroke, as in, was it bleeding or is it blood clot? In Central California, if it's a hemorrhagic stroke, you can put somebody in a helicopter, fly them up to Davis and drill a hole, get the blood out. Maybe they can bring them here and get the blood out. But if you only have one helicopter, Only one person benefits at a time. So that's a hard capacity constraint. And so in everything we do, like even in the cost prediction, I can predict who's going to have an ED visit. But unless we have the bandwidth, the capacity to intercept and do something, we don't get the benefit from that AI. So all that, is about 5 years of work, 25, 30 papers. The gist of it is this one plot. We can make predictions, and then we can rank order patients based on some risk, as in highest risk, lowest risk. And then we take some action, and assuming the action works, we get some benefit. And that could be time saved, it could be money saved, it could be life saved, doesn't matter. And then as we keep taking action, the benefit accumulates, and then we start seeing diminishing returns. The key point is, do we have work capacity to go down the list enough to be anywhere close to the peak? That's something we pay a lot of attention to here. And all of that has been distilled into a process we call a firm assessment. Is the use of a model fair? Is it useful? Is it reliable? And can it be monetarily sustained? Because if we're operating here, we're wasting resources. If we're operating here, we're not actually getting the majority of the benefit we could have gotten. So it's about striking balance. So all of this, we had it in place by end of 2022. Working with Mike Pfeffer, we also came up with a responsible AI life cycle of all of these things. How do we do it in practice? When use cases come in, we have decision making. There's a committee that David chairs. We have these reports that say this many patients will be affected. Yes, we can sustain it. We get a thumbs up, thumbs down. All right. And along came LLMs. Like, okay. So the rest of the world got really excited about chatting with these things and having them take US MLE exams and having headlines saying, oh, they beat doctors in passing exams. We took a slightly different tack. We said, this patient timeline has a language. Natural language is essentially a sequence of tokens from a dictionary. Patient timelines are essentially a sequence of tokens from a dictionary. That dictionary is called CPT codes or ICD codes or RX norm codes. But it's a finite vocabulary, and different people have a different sequence, just like words, like protein sequences, and so on. So if we treat it like a language, we can do some cool things. So that gives us two ways to think about this. Way number one is at the top. We look at documents, we build these language models, and we can chat with them and have them summarize things and so on. Way number two is let's look at entire timelines. And then we can forecast what's going to come next. What's the next token that I expect to see? So we'll first look at this one, and then look at here. So in the first one, there's hundreds of papers already out there. So we did a systematic review asking 5 things. That of the studies that people do, what data are they using? What healthcare task are they doing? What language task are they doing? And what medical specialty? 5 things. So here's the punchline. About 95% of the published work does not do their study using EHR data. Okay, so why should I believe any of it? If we look at the healthcare task, and I'll zoom in here, the commonest thing they do is enhance medical knowledge, which is our euphemism for taking and passing the USMLE exam.
What is LLM? I'm sorry.
Large language model, I'm sorry. Yeah, with the chat GPT and those kinds of things.
Okay.
Yeah. And on the language front, again, no surprise, we're focused on question answering. But if you ask clinicians or patients, what do you want these things to do? Like none of you would say, oh, pass a USMLE exam for me. If we want these things to summarize records for us, translate records for us, and those things that we want them to do, for example, generate clinical referrals, synthesize data for research, we're not studying. So we said, all right, that's the state of affairs. Oh, what happened here? Sorry. Let's study the things we want these things to do. So we said, all right, let's take a few off-the-shelf large language models, as in these things that are ChatGPT and so on. And we did 2 tests. Test number 1 was, remember that green button where we had bedside questions? So we had a bunch of these questions. So we gave those questions to GPT 3.5, that's right here, and to GPT 4. We got an answer, and we had a reference answer. And so we showed it to 12 clinicians and said, tell us whether the GPT answer is agreeing with what we know here, disagreeing, or you can't tell. So from 3.5 to 4, amazing progress. Agreement is up, disagreement is down, unable to assess is down. So great news. But the headline is, about half the time, the physicians can't decide what is the case. That's like having a really confident person at your bedside that says things, and half the time you can't tell whether it's right or wrong. We usually call them second-year med students. I was like, all right. But then we said, all right, one more thing. Our physicians want a few things done with this GPT kind of models. For example, look at this complex referral and summarize from the EHR all the strokes the patient had and the neurological deficit. So we got 15 clinicians and sort of begged, borrowed, cajoled them into taking this, reading the EHR, and then writing out a good answer manually. And then we said, all right, language model, we're going to give you the same task, the same record, and you write out the answer. 35% error rate. Okay, so we're going to wait a little bit to let this technology mature, let OpenAI and Google figure out the hallucinations. Meanwhile, we're going to focus on the timeline. Because if we focus on these timeline-trained models, we can do some really cool things. So what I have on this plot is the number of examples to learn from. 1 to 128 to thousands of examples. And the job I want to do is I want to find patients who have some disease that I don't yet know. So the diagnosis task. Does somebody have undiagnosed familial hypercholesterolemia? I want to know. Do they have undiagnosed primary ciliary dyskinesia? I want to know. But for those kinds of things, I don't have thousands of examples to teach the model. But I do have 64 or 48 examples. The blue line, which is these timeline-trained language models, with just that many examples, can hit about 80% accuracy. With the regular methods, you'd be in the 70s and 60s. Now, this is something you won't see a headline about. But by leveraging this technology, we can get higher accuracy. It trains 8 times faster. It needs 95% less training data. So now we're working on projects where, for rare diseases, let's say 10 of them, we'll work with patient foundations, get those examples, we'll train this classifier, we'll then work with large EHR vendors and say, help us find and diagnose these cases, not only here, but nationwide. So that's just a sense of a flavor of the kinds of things that are now possible with the use of technology. And overall, I would sort of close out with, instead of focusing on building models in a healthcare system, we want to focus on verifying benefits. And at the expense of embarrassing David a little bit, he's a co-author with us on this, creating and shaping the adoption of large language models in medicine. And so I'll close out with the key challenges and opportunities. We need deployment readiness. That's like Mike Pfeffer's job, our CIO. We need to manage the interplay of models, work capacity, ability to take action. That is the responsible AI lifecycle. That is not one person's job. That's everybody's job, along with leadership from clinicians like Dr. Fatima Rodriguez. Then we need to do evaluations that verify presumed benefits. There's a lot of snake oil going around. AI is in bloom. There's a lot of weeds, too. Gotta weed them out. We want the flowers, not the weeds. And then we want to pair this technological innovation with high patient benefit. There's about 8 million undiagnosed rare disease patients nationwide. Can we help find them? Because they bounce around and they suffer for years before somebody figures out their diagnosis. So with that, I will end my planned remarks and invite my colleagues, Mike and Fatima, on stage, and we can talk about whatever comes to mind. So I have a couple of questions to get you warmed up, but if someone has a question already, I don't have to use my questions. All right, there we go.
How much distortion is there in the data from billing code bias?
Here's the microphone.
Yeah. How much distortion is there in the data from billing code bias?
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe I'll take a stab at it. I think a lot. Coding, especially by clinicians, is not very accurate. There's an enormous amount of codes that are for a particular disease. You'll have to specify multiple different parts of that code, and most of the time it's just easier to pick, renal failure, undecided, undiagnosed, whatever. So I don't think that is a great way necessarily to think about this, but when you pair it with the electronic health record clinical data, which has always been really hard before we have these large language models, you can begin to make heads or tails of it. I do think going forward, as we are looking at technologies that can actually do the coding for you and generate codes, that will become much more accurate. So I kind of see us moving in the direction of getting better data using these technologies right up front in the visits.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is codes are always biased, but we remember that patient timeline. We collect a lot of information. So we can look at multiple lines of corroboration. Like, I won't believe somebody's a diabetic just because they have a code. I want to see a metformin prescription. I want to see an HbA1 test. Only then I'll believe. So if you triangulate across modalities, you can overcome some of those biases.
Could you clarify more when you said that bedside, that you looked at that 80% of decisions made were based on no science? You mean that they just did their experience or they guessed? What exactly did you mean by that statement?
Yeah, so 80% of the situations, the exact state medical situation had never been studied in a randomized trial or a prospective study of any kind. There is related evidence, and the physician would have to decide based on their training and what they know about other similar situations and extrapolate and make a decision. And the point being, physicians do this extrapolation all the time, and we record it in the EHR. So why don't we just go back and see when was the last time somebody else had to do this, and then base our next decision factoring that in.
I'll add to that I'm a cardiologist, so as clinicians, a lot of the times we base what we do, we know it's right, on class 1 data, meaning there's been a randomized controlled trial. But even in cardiology, where there's very good data, we only do that about 10% of the time. The rest of the time is based on expert opinion, consensus, it sort of makes sense. And a lot of that thought process, it may be embedded in the electronic health record, and that's, I think, what Dr. Shah is referring to, the experiment.
We're in a very exciting time now because one of the things that Nigam has talked about in looking at what clinicians have done in the past, you can also then pair that with outcomes because you have that longitudinal data. So is that expert decision or, extrapolation at the time, did it result in a good outcome? And so we've actually opened up to our faculty access to 290 million longitudinal patient records through our EHR provider, Epic. So they can go in and look at those questions at a very, very large scale, a scale we've never been able to do before. Actually, Nigam is doing some work on that as well, but really, really exciting now to see that data come together and be able to start to ask those questions. It's too expensive to do randomized controlled trials for every decision, so this is a new way of thinking about it.
I don't want to scare people, though. We know what we're doing. These are for the gray areas.
Speaking of gray areas, and if this takes us too far down the rabbit hole, I'm happy to back out and talk about it later. The insurance companies, You mentioned that you went down the road to get the funding for part of the basis for the companies that were doing this. And you talked about the coding, which is what confuses most insurance companies. I'm curious what role they're playing in all this. And I know we're medically focused tonight, but we're kind of not, aren't we, at the same time? Because you're very practical about where you're going with this.
So dealing with insurance is always an interesting proposition. There are some short-term things that can be done. So for example, language models are great at just mass manufacturing appeal letters to insurers. And I'm sure they'll have language models mass manufacturing denial letters. So we can have a little war of the bots and see who wins. But on a more practical note, this whole process of prior authorization, if we appeal to prior similar cases, we can make it more rational and say, look, 90% of the time in a similar situation, the bots fought and you said yes. So can we just avoid the fight and say yes? And then free up the human mind to focus on the 10% or so of cases where a genuine conversation is necessary for an approval decision.
This is almost built for that process.
You're missing the float. That's the whole point of that. By holding on to the money for an extra month, 2 months, 6 months, that's why. It doesn't matter that they know they're going to lose. It's the float.
That too, yes?
I agree. I mean, if you think about it, let's say we were 100% perfect on creating the codes and sending them to insurance companies, and that every patient that needed the test would get approved. There's not enough money in the insurance companies to do that. There's a limit at which, it's going to happen. So on one hand, we have to be pretty advanced in how we are doing this so we stay ahead, because those that actually are providing more automated coding and revenue cycle management is going to do better on the insurance company side. But ultimately, if we can reduce the whole burden and not have bots fighting bots and just do this right at the point of care, then maybe all that administrative waste could be used to better approve more people. And so that's kind of the dream. We'll see. It's going to be a real partnership between healthcare organizations and insurers. But ultimately, I can imagine a world not too far off where the clinician will, be in the clinic with you. You'll have your conversation. We'll write the note. We're doing that now. That note will then automatically be coded. Those codes processed and sent directly to the insurance company. Why does a physician even need to bill?
Yeah. So I'll give a very concrete example. It takes us about $20.90 to produce a bill. There's 300 million people in the country, and let's say on average, everybody sees their doctor once a quarter. Or let's say 5 times, just to make the math simple. So we spend $100 just producing a paper bill per person on average. That's $30 billion. Just producing a paper bill. Half the budget of the NIH. And that's one inefficiency. So I think there's opportunities. Yes, there will always be those insurance pressures and so on, but if we can point these technologies right, and we can remove these sort of nonsensical friction points, we can unlock the space for a lot of innovation.
So one of the problems with chat, particularly the original chat, was the lack of source attribution on information, which they've tried to improve somewhat in 4.0. But if I were a clinician, I'd be much more interested in being told why the model was making a prediction so that I could add that to the rest of my instinct. Are we going to be able to do that, do you think? And
Yeah, sure, and that's a great question. So I recently used ChatGPT to say, to give a few examples of some studies around how visualizing plaque in the heart can motivate changes in behavior. And they came up with this amazing randomized control trial. That was a trial that I was doing that I haven't done yet. And I was just like, oh my goodness, I panicked. I said, somebody's doing this study that I'm gonna spend 5 years doing. And then I just said, did you make this up? I said it to ChatGPT, and they said, yes, I apologize. And it sounded like a good idea and the answer that you wanted. And I said, can you please give me some real evidence? And I was like, take a picture of this. I'm going to put this in all my talks. This is crazy. And then it gave me the real study that is sort of modeled after. So I was like, it knew it was lying to me. But it was useful information, again, in how you design a trial. Of course, this is getting much better, so an earlier ChatGPT version. And then we do have some versions of this that are vetted, and they're tested in real training data. There's one, I forget the name, Nigam may know, but it can actually give you accurate medical references that are cited in PubMed.
Open evidence.
Open evidence. I knew he would know.
By the way,
Can I add one thing to this? Because it's a great question.
absolutely, and you also have to introduce yourself and
Oh.
make your opening remarks, which we forgot.
We work with Nigam, that's our
Yeah.
introduction.
Make us what he said.
This is really, really cool. On our School of Medicine website, we have the first generative AI search for medical school. And so you can go to the School of Medicine website and go to the search, and it will bring up a response. In that response, it will give you the references of where it put together its search. And so the large models, like GPT-4, for example, it's really about just immense probabilities of words coming, which words are going to come next. But when you limit it to, say, a finite set of information, like the website, so it only returns responses from the School of Medicine website, then it can pick out the sources of where that's coming from. So a lot of what's happening in medicine as we think about chart summarizations, things like that, we will actually footnote where the source is coming from. The only caution is over time, clinicians will believe it because it looks great and will stop spending the time going back and looking where it came from. So that's why I think Nigam rightfully pointed out this is not ready for prime time yet to do chart summarizations, 35% inaccurate response, as you saw there. So we got to get that a lot better because ultimately, who has the time to go back and look at all the different references?
Okay, I'll introduce myself. I'm Fatima Rodriguez. I'm a cardiologist, associate professor, and I run our section for preventive cardiology. And really, AI for me is a tool to do my job better. I'm a clinical cardiologist, and I spend a lot of time trying to prevent disease. Usually people that have risk factors who've had an event, but often we have a lot of information just sitting there in medical records and in other imaging studies. So our work is really focused on opportunistic imaging to try to understand when people are at risk for heart disease. But I completely agree with what Nigam says. It's not about the model. There are many models. We have a model. Everybody has a model. It's about the application of those models. And now our group has been working very closely with Mike and others and our CEO on how do we integrate this into clinical care. Again, once we open the floodgates, what's the capacity? Who will see these patients? If something seems like a good idea, but then it causes a lot of downstream testing, a lot of anxiety, that's something that we really have to balance. So happy to chat more about that. Yes?
As I'm listening to you, having dealt with insurance companies in my practice, I'm wondering, as this information becomes more accurate, how it's going to affect the relationship between clinicians and the nature of insurance companies. Because it seems actuarially, insurance companies have relied on data from the past, but you're generating data about the very same things. And I wonder if that will transform the nature of insurance companies.
I don't have a final answer for that, but I will say that, of course, you're creating new diagnoses that potentially nobody knew about. And especially when you're undiagnosed, and we have this large grant that Nigam's leading around undiagnosed disease. And again, in my field in cardiovascular disease, there's a lot of this. The reality is that if you look deeply now, it's probably already there. It's already in your electronic health record. Coronary plaque, if you look deeply into the radiology reports, 95% of the time, it's in there embedded with all the words. But the patient doesn't, that's not the reason they're getting the study. So what we're trying to do is get that information and make it useful, make it actionable, and for us to create a way to care for the patients. And I don't think that's going to change. And sometimes that actually can help us in the insurance side. So I spend a lot of time trying to get approval for therapies for cardiovascular prevention, Ozempic, all those medications that are very hard to get. And sometimes I'm happy that AI has identified these. I'm like, aha, atherosclerosis. If we use the word, the insurance evil chatbots will approve this medication because, again, it meets the level. So I think we have to just be clever about it. And of course, the same way we're using it for these reasons, other people can use it for sinister reasons. And what I don't want is for people to be denied things like life insurance or for premiums to go up because of data that was identified incidentally through artificial intelligence. And I think that's your appropriate concern.
I had a couple of questions on data. So two-part question. How far back is Stanford medical records digitized, and how far back are you planning to go to digitize records?
So it's a great question. I've been here for about a little over 3 years, so it's been digitized for that long.
Good
I think
job.
It goes back to,
So Epic was 2007 was when Epic came out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 2007 was the start of the digitized medical record. Pathology, radiology has been
Much farther, yeah.
much further. So we have all that data, and then pathology is probably in the last 5 years.
And then the second part of the question is, there's been some studies recently that medical devices actually do, the raw data is more important than the data you see on an EKG. And so are you working with medical device makers to have access to the data? Because I know it was a big fight with EKG manufacturers at one point.
So not with most of them, but there's a few faculty. For example, there's I think Professor Shreyas Vasanwala, who's working on getting the intermediate readout from an MRI machine so that we can make the MRI faster. Particularly when you're dealing with kids, for example, they don't lie still in an MRI machine. You have to sedate them. Now, if you can reduce the procedure time from 30 minutes to, say, 7 minutes, and use essentially algorithms to process the intermediate readout, so point solutions are happening across the board. I don't know, we probably use 5,000 devices, 10,000 devices. So there's no sort of concentrated effort, but individual efforts definitely.
And one example that we are doing is, for example, for XioPatch, those little monitors you wear for heart rhythm abnormalities. Again, usually most people would look at just the results, right, what the summary is, but we very much look at the data and try to study it, try to find predictors of outcomes. And again, a lot of these the company owns and is proprietary, but we have a lot of our faculty who have either consult for the companies or they've gone on to industry, and we've definitely nurtured and maintained those relationships because they're very valuable.
Hi, I was on the back of that question. I was wondering if you get the data from a lot of major medical centers and it increases your timeline just so much faster. And do you have that ability? But then we have such a heterogeneous group of people in this country, but if you went to Italy or France or Vietnam or something, you'd have different stuff, but it would still be helpful. But I mean, is that something that wouldn't cost that much because you have data people like yourselves? Not that you don't get paid a lot, but in every other country to start inputting, and then that would really increase the AI and teach the bot to learn faster. I was just wondering if that's something that's out there.
It is happening. Mike mentioned Epic's Cosmos data source, which is an aggregation of all the data, mostly US hospitals who've signed on onto that platform. And then on the research side, there are some large international collaboratives. The one that's worth knowing is Odyssey, OHDSI, Observational Health Data Science and Informatics. It has about 100 or 150 sites worldwide with about 1 billion patients worth of data converted into a common schema on which people can do studies. It's all, in some sense, manual because the data are not in one place. So you have to design the study, then sort of send it to everybody. They run it. So it still takes a couple of months. But 1 billion people data set does exist based on collaborations.
And I'll say the radiology world has always been ahead of us on this, and there are a lot of imaging repositories for national studies. The challenging part is when you have a clinical question, sometimes that data is not linked to the imaging data, and just creating those connections, especially to harmonize them across different health systems and sometimes servers. To your point, I think the lessons from digitizing of records, when I was a medical resident in Boston not that long ago, we had paper charts. And everybody's like, oh, Epic. Oh, and it happened. And of course, we've learned adoptions. There's some things that we like, there's some things that we don't like, but it's happening. And I would say that is happening with artificial intelligence in medicine. And we want to be at the table and inform those decisions so that they are practical and useful up to the clinicians and to the patients that we care for.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing because it's a great question. Data sharing, especially when it's not de-identified data, is a huge challenge, as it should be, because there's privacy concerns, security concerns. And as you start to bring together different kinds of data, what was de-identified could start to be identified. So imagine a pathology slide plus a CT scan plus your EHR data plus your genome. Well, they could all be de-identified, but put them together, and it gets a little more complicated. So what we're looking at is how can you do learning across multiple sites without the data ever leaving or be seen by a human? And this idea of federated learning is, I think, where the future is going. And there's still a lot that needs to be worked out. But in other words, our data would be accessible to be learned on, but no one could actually take it or see it. So it remains private, remains secure, it remains within our possession. But instead of faculty having to do manual processes, getting bits of data from all over the place, ultimately we'd like to get into this area. And there's technologies now being developed where we think that's going to be a possibility. So we're really excited about that. We have a really state-of-the-art research data repository we call STAR, and we're building STAR 2.0. And STAR 2.0 is going to leverage all of these new technologies. It's going to have multiple data sets in it. Right now we have EHR data, we have some imaging data, we have waveform data, the raw data actually from waveforms. We're going to add pathology, genomics, all these other things to that data set. So our faculty can do amazing things across this data set, and ultimately, we hope that others, when the technology is safe and private, can learn off data sets around the world, basically.
So I'm curious, it's wonderful to hear actually about all the tailwinds around the technology and what you're able to design and create. I'm wondering, just like we hear about out in the open, so there's so many AI tools out there, ChatGPT, Claude, you name it, but the users, there's tremendous headwinds. There's not that much adoption, as you would think, of AI tools. What are you seeing with your clinicians, your physicians at Stanford Medicine around actual adoption of some of these tools or these technologies? And what are you looking to solve for in that area?
I can start. I mean, as cardiology is always a quick adopter of technology in the specialties in general, just because we are so digitally driven. But I think for clinicians, and I'll speak for myself, like you want the tool to solve something. We were just joking before that there's always tech companies that come and say, I have all solutions to end all heart disease. And I'm like, great. Do you want to shadow me in clinic for like an hour? And then they're over it by the end. They're like, oh, it's so complicated. You have to get them in. And there's sometimes there's reasons for the madness, but sometimes there aren't. So I think, so just to answer your question briefly, I said it has to solve some sort of problem for them. And of course, a great example of this, not AI, but technology, was telemedicine during the pandemic, right? I was one of the quick adopters of telemedicine. Everybody said, for cardiology, it will never work. Patients like to come in. Patients love to come in. Turns out not for every visit, and we're still 80% telemedicine for certain visits. So that's, again, but it's solving a problem. So I think for us in clinical medicine, there's patient-related problems. Like if we're able to diagnose you earlier, when there's still a cure, when there's prevention as possible, when we're being really proactive instead of reactive for medicine, I think most patients would like that with some appropriate guardrails. Where in my clinician hat, I want something that helps me preserve my relationship with my patient. So, and of course, we heard from Mike about the ambient AI writing notes for us. Fantastic if I actually have more time to spend with my patient. Responding to messages in ways that are helpful, fantastic. But it's solving a problem, not just like an end-to-end solution.
Yeah, it's a great question. Implementation science is something that I really, really love, because when we're looking to purchase technologies, build technologies in this space, implementation is everything, right? If you don't get it right, if your go live isn't good, if you haven't thought of the workflows, it doesn't work. And so most technology fails for two reasons. One is it's too complicated to use. So usability, it doesn't work. Data's presented in the wrong way, or it's not within the typical systems that clinicians use. So if you have to jump outside a system to see something, it's not going to work. And so usability is key. And the second is workflow. You have to be able to do something with whatever it is you get. And a lot of these technologies produce things that you can't actually do anything with or you don't trust. Like there's a lot of clinical summarization companies out there that pitch to us all the time. But as Nigam showed, when you actually look at the performance of these things, they're not very good. So at this point, we wouldn't release something like that because we know it wouldn't be trusted by our clinicians. So trust, usability, workflows, those are really the key things.
Yeah, and so the one thing I would add, I mean, I think the business people refer to as brownfield, greenfield innovation. If you look at the existing work patterns and put technology in it, lots of issues come up. But there's a way to think about it is, can we imagine an entirely new way of doing business given the technology at our disposal? So I'll give you a concrete example, and it's a totally fictional example. Let's say dermatology. Dermatology usually has a lot of access issues. There's like 60-day wait time, 90-day wait time. And you might have a brick and mortar practice. We have clinics in Portola Valley, clinics in Redwood City. And you might overlay tech on it, saying now we have a My Health app, and you can take a picture of the lesion, and a dermatologist will look at it for you. But no new capacity is opened, or a little bit. I mean, in-person visit might have taken 15 minutes. This might take them 8 minutes. So, okay, you've increased capacity. But if you imagine a dermatology practice that is 80% virtual, offered to the entire state of California just because our licenses stop right there, and 80% of the diagnosis is also done by the algorithm. And only certain things are escalated to the human review. And of that, only certain things need to come in to a physical facility. Now, how would you design such a business? Where would you place your locations? Probably not in Portola Valley and Redwood City. So if we think in that way, it is possible to build entirely new workflows on the backs of technology which have much higher adoption and much higher value.
Hello. At the end of the day, it's all about outcomes, patient outcomes. How do you measure it today? And could you say that in cardiology, for instance, there are fewer patients who get heart attacks in the population than 10 years ago and 20 years ago? And what's this technology going to do? Is it incremental, or is it going to be, it's going to be 20, 30, 40% improvements from where we are, and eventually we're going to see this in life expectancy. I mean, I just read a newspaper report about life expectancy in the U.S. expected to be the same as it is today over the next 20 years. So with all these technologies, I mean, there's a bunch of buzz. It all sounds exciting. What is it that you realistically expect in terms of outcomes?
Well, I think when you talk about outcomes, there's a lot of different outcomes. As a cardiologist, I tend to be, the hard outcomes, prevent heart attacks, strokes, and death, but there's a lot of other outcomes that people care about. And so for those kind of outcomes, you may need a randomized control trial. For these outcomes, like, is it patient satisfaction? Is it access? Are we increasing capacity in our healthcare system? All those things could be measured pretty immediately.
Are patients not dying?
Yeah.
Fewer deaths, right? I mean, that's the ultimate outcome.
That's the ultimate outcome long term. I agree with you. And I think for the cardiovascular research and the things, yes, we've shown that deploying these algorithms in the research setting increases the use of statins. And we know that from clinical trials definitively for patients that have coronary disease, that reduces the risk of heart attacks. Are we gonna see that in 1 year? Probably not. In 5 years? Yes, because that's what kind of our clinical trial data shows. But I think we don't have to wait 5, 10 years to see benefits. I think there's more proximate outcomes that we can measure.
It's a really great question because I'll give you an example of a process and outcome measure challenge that we had in AI, which I think is really interesting. But fundamentally, you remember the timeline that Nigam showed, right? What's the last point on everybody's timeline? So the question is not so much that in my mind, it's if we can identify something that's going to give you a better quality of life before that endpoint, because the endpoint's going to happen. So we're really trying to either prevent the endpoint from happening too early, or if we know it's going to happen, can we do things that are going to make the quality of life between now and that endpoint better? So how we do that and how we think about these things are part of kind of our responsible AI life cycle in measuring outcomes. But outcomes takes time, and so we'll often measure process measures to see, do we think that everybody who has coronary artery calcification on a CT scan gets put on a statin, because we know that that should improve outcomes, but we're going to have to wait until we measure that. So right now we're kind of stuck in process measure land. But ultimately, I think we'll be able to measure pretty good outcomes. So the story I'll tell you about process outcome, we deployed a tool that gives clinicians a starting draft to reply to a patient message that comes in through our portal, MyHealth. It's just a draft. It's a starting point. The clinician has to review it and edit it and send it out, or just get rid of it altogether. Adoption, 20% of messages that get this prompt, they actually use the prompt and edit it, which is, in fact, great in healthcare. So we're super happy with 20% in healthcare. But we measured the amount of time saved for clinicians by doing this. How much time did we save clinicians spending in their inbox responding to messages with this new tool? 0
minutes a day.
Yeah, 0.
No, zero.
We saved them no time. Process measure. Now, we could have tossed the whole thing away, but luckily we have some really smart people at Stanford who said, well, why don't we also measure burnout, an outcome measure? Are our physicians less burnt out because we're giving them a prompt, or we're reducing cognitive burden? Turns out we reduced burnout. So the outcome measure here actually trumped the process measure. If we just measured the process measure, we would have stopped the project because it costs money to run this algorithm. But it turned out the outcome measure was what saved the day. And so to your point, we have to measure outcomes ultimately when we put these technologies in.
Okay, I have a quick question. From a realistic, practical point of view, how much time do you think it'll be before that will be at the hand of the doctors and that they can use that platform to help, like putting all the data, getting all the information necessary?
The bedside question answer?
My question is when I can come to my doctor and tell him to look at all my records and get the benefit of what you are
Today, Stanford physicians request about 1,000 consultations per year at the bedside today.
Good answer, thank you.
And and this is going to expand and expand as these new technologies really take place. We're going to capture better data with the AI ambient scribe, which will feed into the ability to do the prognosticograms, which will then also lead us to be able to make better diagnoses, and the list goes on and on and on. We've just launched the ability to capture genomic data, so genomic testing data, in the electronic health record, so we could start to run decision support on that. We're going to be piloting something called pharmacogenomic decision support, where if we do have genomic variants, we can actually tell the physician if they prescribe a medicine in real time, if that medicine is going to interact with your genome. So all these things are coming to the bedside, but we do have things live right now. And I think that's what's amazing about being here at Stanford, is we get to really not only take advantage of these things early, but help all of the health systems around the country and the world really figure out how to do this. It's a very exciting time. So thank you. I think that's our last question.
That is our last question, and all of these benefits compound. The imaging work, the pharmacogenomics work, the bedside question answering. Individually, they might seem, but ultimately they'll all connect. And then we get these unreasonable efficiencies because we've put everything together. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for great questions.
That's pretty exciting. I mean, if you look at an enablement tool that allows us to better enable with the data that we're collecting, the piece that I think about, and I love the questions, in fact, we should get a panel of you experts in the room to actually help us with our product development. We are a wealthy source of data. There are so many different mechanisms, devices, pieces that we aren't leveraging. And I think this is where these tools, not only is it the technology now and the computer horsepower, quite frankly, that allows us to be able to crunch these large data sets, but it's now the tools that allow us to be able to use this to enable. So I hope you saw in what we probably whetted your appetite a little bit more about some of the things that are going on in AI. I will say Stanford is uniquely differentiated in the country in developing these tools and products. Now, I'll also share that there's a lot of tools and products out there, and I hope that what you also heard is there's a lot of work that goes into assessing some of the design. Nigam and Mike and others that are working on actually validation models that are actually helping us test some of what we're seeing that's coming in, because there is a lot of noise that are coming in through some of these tools to make sure that we're using the right and effective pieces. So, and I say whet your appetite. Did you notice you have some seeds to plant? Now, the more important part about those seeds, not is that you have to weed around them, as Nigam was sharing, but it also has the dates for our second and third AI in bloom. And things truly, as you see tonight, are in bloom, and we have the opportunity to be able to share a little bit more with you, and I hope that you take the opportunity to join us for those sessions as well. We now would like to join you, and you just literally have to stand up and turn around, and you will be in the reception as well, and you'll have the opportunity to interact with our panelists. Thank you again for being here with us tonight.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.